Throw it away. Nobody is coming back for that junk. Ethan Harrington's cold voice sliced through the marble hallway before the old envelope even touched the table. Naomi Brooks froze, her fingertips still resting on the faded papers she had discovered hidden inside a forgotten library book that had not been checked out in more than 30 years. Dust floated through thin beams of afternoon sunlight pouring across the reading room windows, while the quiet hum of the ventilation system suddenly felt deafening. The envelope was worn, its edges softened by decades, but one name remained perfectly clear in dark blue ink. Ethan Harrington. The same white millionaire now standing only a few feet away, surrounded by board members, donors, and flashing cameras celebrating his latest multimillion-dollar donation to the city library. Naomi looked from the envelope to his face. Something inside her refused to let go. "Sir," she said carefully, holding the letter with both hands, "I think someone wanted you to have this." Ethan barely glanced at her. His polished shoes clicked sharply against the hardwood floor as he stepped closer. His expensive cologne mixed with the smell of old books and polished oak shelves. "Do you know how many people invent reasons to get close to me?" he asked without lowering his voice. Several guests exchanged amused looks. A woman in pearls smiled behind her champagne glass. Another donor whispered something that made two men laugh. Naomi felt every eye settle on her library badge instead of her face. "I am not asking for anything," she replied quietly. Ethan gave a dry laugh. "That is usually how it starts." The room grew painfully still. Even the photographers hesitated before lowering their cameras. Naomi swallowed but did not lower the envelope. She had spent 12 years protecting forgotten stories, preserving names nobody remembered anymore, believing every page mattered because every life mattered. This felt different. The paper seemed almost warm against her fingers, as if someone had waited decades for this exact moment. Ethan looked toward his security chief. "Please escort her away before this turns into another publicity stunt." The words landed harder than he intended. Naomi's shoulders stiffened. She nodded once, refusing to argue. The security guard approached, almost apologetic, gesturing toward the exit. Soft footsteps echoed across the polished floor as she walked away beneath towering shelves filled with silent witnesses. Outside, late afternoon rain had begun tapping against the library's stone steps. Naomi paused beneath the front columns. She looked down again at the envelope. A tiny tear along one corner exposed paper far older than the cover itself. Something caught her eye. Beneath the flap, almost invisible beneath brittle glue, another sentence had been written in tiny handwriting. Her heartbeat quickened. She carefully eased the flap open just enough to read a single line. The color drained from her face. She slowly lifted her eyes toward the enormous glass windows where Ethan was laughing with reporters inside, completely unaware that everything he believed about his past was only seconds away from collapsing. Naomi read the hidden sentence again, her pulse hammering against her fingertips. The faded ink was barely visible beneath the brittle flap. "Do not let my son believe I abandoned him." The rain grew heavier, tapping against the stone steps like impatient fingers. Inside the library, applause erupted as Ethan Harrington smiled for another photograph beneath crystal lights, completely unaware that a single forgotten sentence had just cracked open the foundation of his past. Naomi closed the envelope carefully. She could have walked away. Nobody would have blamed her after the humiliation she had just endured. Instead, she turned back toward the entrance. Warm air rushed over her as the glass doors slid open. Conversation softened the instant guests noticed the librarian returning. A donor rolled his eyes. Another whispered, "She really cannot take a hint." Ethan noticed her from across the room. His jaw tightened. "I thought we were finished," he said. Naomi stopped several feet away, refusing to raise her voice. "I found something you need to see." Ethan exhaled sharply, more irritated than curious. "Miss Brooks, I have investors waiting. This cannot wait." The confidence in her answer drew unexpected silence across the room. Even the photographers lowered their cameras again. Ethan glanced toward his legal advisor, who gave a subtle shrug. "1 minute," Ethan said coldly. You have exactly 1 minute. Naomi stepped forward and extended the envelope without moving another inch. Please open it yourself. Ethan stared at the fragile paper as though it were contaminated. What is this? Another emotional trick? No, sir. Her voice remained calm. Just the truth, if you are willing to read it. A quiet laugh escaped one of the board members. This is becoming embarrassing. Ethan finally accepted the envelope between 2 fingers. The paper felt strangely delicate, almost weightless. As he unfolded the first page, the room filled only with the soft crackle of aged paper and the distant rumble of thunder outside. His confident expression barely changed during the first few lines. Then his eyes stopped moving. His breathing slowed. A tiny crease appeared between his brows. Naomi noticed the color draining from his face before anyone else did. Ethan looked back at the signature. Then at the handwriting. Then back at the signature again. His fingers trembled almost imperceptibly. That is impossible, he whispered. His attorney leaned closer. Sir? Ethan ignored him. He read the same paragraph again, slower this time. The woman who had supposedly abandoned him had described the tiny birthmark behind his left ear, the lullaby she used to sing before thunderstorms, and the wooden toy train only the 2 of them knew had disappeared the night they were separated. Nobody else could have known those details. Nobody. The laughter around the room faded into uneasy silence. Naomi watched his carefully constructed confidence begin to fracture. Ethan lifted his eyes toward her for the first time without arrogance. Where did you find this? His voice no longer carried authority. It carried fear. Naomi answered honestly. Inside a history book that had not been opened since 1994. Ethan lowered his gaze again. Something thin slipped from between the folded pages and floated gently onto the polished marble floor. It was not another letter. It was an old black and white photograph. Naomi bent down first. The moment she turned it over, both she and Ethan froze. Standing beside his mother in the picture was a man Ethan had trusted his entire life. The photograph slipped from Naomi's trembling fingers onto the polished marble floor, and the sharp click echoed through the silent library louder than any shout. Every head turned. Ethan bent down first, but stopped halfway, his hand suspended in the air as if touching the picture might make it real. The flash from a reporter's phone reflected across the glossy surface of the photograph. Standing beside his smiling mother was a younger version of Richard Coleman, the trusted white family attorney who had managed Ethan's fortune for nearly 3 decades. Ethan stared without blinking. That cannot be him. His voice sounded hollow. Naomi slowly picked up the photograph, careful not to bend its brittle corners. The back carried another date in faded pencil. October 12, 1994. Below it, 5 words written in the same elegant handwriting as the letter. Richard promised he would help. A murmur swept through the donors like wind through dry leaves. Richard Coleman had arrived only minutes earlier for the charity ceremony. Now every pair of eyes found him standing near the rear of the room, one hand gripping his leather briefcase so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The smile he had worn for every camera all afternoon disappeared. Ethan looked at him. Richard? The older attorney adjusted his tie before forcing a calm expression. Old photographs can be misleading. Naomi never looked away from him. She noticed the tiny bead of sweat forming near his temple despite the cool air humming from the ceiling vents. Richard took one measured step forward. His polished shoes clicked against the marble with practiced confidence. Miss Brooks, he said, offering a polite smile that never reached his eyes, you have already caused enough confusion today. I believe it would be best if you gave those documents to me. Naomi tightened her grip on the letter instead. I found them in the library archives. They belong to history. Richard's smile faded. They belong to Mr. Harrington. Ethan extended his hand without taking his eyes off Richard. Give them to me. For one long second Richard did not move. Then he laughed softly. Ethan, you are letting emotion cloud your judgment. That sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Ethan's expression changed. For years Richard had been the man with every answer, every financial decision, every family memory Ethan could no longer verify. Suddenly every conversation felt different. Every silence carried new weight. Naomi spoke carefully. "Sir, there is something else." She turned the photograph over again, running her thumb across the lower edge until another folded piece of paper loosened from behind the backing. The crowd leaned closer instinctively. Even the security guards forgot their positions. Ethan watched Naomi unfold the hidden slip with extraordinary care. It was not another letter. It was a receipt from a private storage facility dated just 6 days after his mother's reported disappearance. Across the bottom was a handwritten note. Box 17. Keep everything sealed until the boy turns 40. Ethan's breathing became uneven. He was 39 years old. Richard stepped forward much faster this time. "That is enough." His voice cracked for the first time all afternoon. Naomi instinctively stepped back. Ethan moved between them before Richard could reach the papers. Neither man spoke. The only sound came from dozens of phone cameras quietly beginning to record. Ethan looked directly into Richard's eyes, searching for the truth he had trusted for most of his life. Richard finally lowered his gaze. Then, almost under his breath, he whispered 5 words that froze the entire room. "You were never supposed to know." Richard's whisper hung in the air like ice. "You were never supposed to know." Nobody moved. The only sound came from dozens of phone cameras quietly recording and the low hum of the library's climate system. Ethan stared at the man who had handled every contract, every inheritance, every legal decision since he was a child. His breathing became uneven. "Explain it," he said. Richard's jaw tightened. "This is not the place." Naomi noticed something no one else did. Richard was not looking at Ethan. His eyes kept drifting toward the faded storage receipt still resting in her hand. She turned it over once more beneath the cold ceiling lights. Along one edge, nearly hidden by age, was a tiny embossed seal. It matched the seal stamped on a restricted archive room deep beneath the library. Her pulse quickened. "This receipt was filed through the library," she said quietly. "Someone wanted these records hidden where nobody would think to look." A wave of whispers swept through the donors. Ethan looked from the receipt to Naomi. "There is more, is there not?" Before she could answer, Richard stepped forward. "Give me those documents." His calm voice had disappeared. "They are privileged family records." Naomi did not flinch. "Then why were they hidden inside a public library?" Richard opened his mouth but nothing came out. The silence lasted only seconds before another voice interrupted. "She is right." Everyone turned. An elderly archivist emerged from behind the circulation desk, his gray cardigan dusted with paper fibers. His hands trembled as he removed a small brass key from his pocket. "I catalogued a sealed donation 30 years ago. I was ordered never to open it." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Who gave that order?" The old man slowly lifted his gaze toward Richard. Every face in the room followed. Richard's confidence cracked for the first time. "You are remembering incorrectly." The archivist shook his head. "I remember because you told me some truths are too dangerous for children." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Reporters edged closer, microphones lowering as if afraid to disturb the moment. Naomi studied the brass key. The number engraved into its handle matched the receipt exactly. Box 17. Ethan reached for it, but the archivist hesitated. "There was one instruction," he whispered. "The box must be opened only in the presence of the person it belongs to." Richard suddenly raised his voice. "This conversation ends now." Security guards exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of whom to obey. Ethan's expression hardened. "No. It begins now." Richard's face strained of color. His phone vibrated sharply inside his jacket. The screen lit up for only an instant before he tried to hide it, but Naomi caught the sender's name reflected in the polished marble floor. It was the same storage company listed on the receipt. Another message appeared beneath the first. 4 words. "They found box 17. Richard closed his eyes for one brief second. When he opened them again, the fear on his face said something inside that box was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The notification on Richard's phone vanished, but the fear remained frozen across his face. Naomi saw it before anyone else did. His steady hands had begun to shake. Around them, the library felt smaller with every passing second. Camera shutters clicked in rapid bursts. Investors exchanged uneasy glances. The soft hum of the climate system suddenly sounded like distant machinery straining under impossible pressure. Ethan stepped closer, his polished shoes echoing across the marble floor. "What is inside box 17?" he asked. Richard looked away. "You do not want that answer." The words only deepened the silence. Naomi tightened her grip on the brass key. The cool metal pressed into her palm, its worn edges polished smooth by decades of waiting. She studied the engraved number once more, then lifted her eyes toward the restricted archive corridor beyond the reading room. Something felt wrong. "The box was never meant to stay hidden forever," she said quietly. Richard's voice rose sharply. "You have no idea what you are interfering with." Several board members immediately turned toward Naomi instead of Richard. One folded his arms. "How do we know any of this is real?" Another added. "Everything changed the moment she appeared." Their suspicion spread through the room faster than the whispers. Naomi suddenly felt every stare settle on her again. 12 years of protecting forgotten history meant nothing against a few seconds of doubt. Even the security guards shifted closer, uncertain whether to protect her or remove her. Ethan noticed it. For a brief moment, he said nothing. His eyes moved from Naomi's calm expression to Richard's growing panic. One person stood perfectly still. The other looked as though the floor itself might collapse beneath him. That difference became impossible to ignore. The elderly archivist cleared his throat. "There is one more record." Every conversation stopped. He reached inside an old leather satchel and slowly removed a brittle ledger wrapped in faded cloth. Dust floated into the cold overhead lights as he laid it across the circulation desk. "This book has never left the archives." Richard took an involuntary step forward. "Do not open it." His voice cracked again. Naomi gently untied the cloth. The worn leather cover creaked as though waking from a long sleep. Inside were handwritten entries dating back more than 30 years. Donations. Transfers. Restricted collections. Then one page made her stop. The ink had faded, but one signature remained unmistakably clear. Richard Coleman. Beneath it was another name that made Ethan's breathing catch. Margaret Harrington. His mother's signature. Side by side. Dated 8 months after the official records claimed she had disappeared. Ethan stared at the page as though the air had been pulled from the room. "She signed this?" he whispered. The archivist nodded slowly. "She came here herself." A wave of disbelief swept across the donors. One investor quietly lowered his phone. Another removed his glasses, unable to look away. Richard closed his eyes. His carefully controlled composure finally collapsed. "It was supposed to protect him," he said almost inaudibly. Ethan looked up, confusion replacing anger. "Protect me from what?" Richard never answered. Before anyone could speak again, a piercing alarm echoed from deep beneath the library. Red emergency lights flashed across the marble walls. Somewhere below them, heavy steel doors began unlocking one after another. Naomi's eyes widened. She recognized the sequence immediately. Someone else had just accessed the restricted archives, and they were heading straight for box 17. The red emergency lights continued to pulse across the marble walls, then, one by one, they fell dark. The alarm faded into a low mechanical hum that seemed even more unsettling than the noise itself. Nobody spoke. The silence pressed against every person in the library like invisible weight. Somewhere below, a heavy steel door finished unlocking with a deep metallic thud that echoed through the building. Ethan did not move. His eyes remained fixed on Naomi, no longer with suspicion, but with a question he could not bring himself to ask. Around them, investors slowly lowered their phones. The excitement had disappeared. Something far more dangerous had taken its place. Richard stood motionless, his shoulders sagging beneath the perfectly tailored suit that had always made him appear untouchable. For the first time in decades, he looked old. Truly old. Naomi glanced toward the restricted archive corridor. A faint draft drifted through the hallway, carrying the familiar scent of aging paper, cedar shelves, and cool concrete. She had worked in this building for 12 years. She knew every sound it made. "Someone is already downstairs," she said quietly. Her calm voice cut through the room more sharply than another alarm ever could. Richard closed his eyes. "We are too late." Ethan turned toward him. "Too late for what?" Richard never answered. Naomi looked back at the brass key resting in her palm. Under the cold ceiling lights, she noticed another detail she had somehow missed. Tiny scratches crossed one side of the handle, not from age, but from repeated use. The key had not been forgotten. Someone had been returning to it again and again. She gently traced the marks with her thumb. "This was never the only key," she whispered. The elderly archivist looked up immediately. His breathing caught. "No," he said softly. "There were two." A ripple passed through the room. Ethan's heartbeat seemed loud enough for him to hear it himself. "Who had the second key?" The archivist hesitated. His weathered hands trembled around the old ledger. "I believed it had been destroyed." Richard slowly opened his eyes. There was no anger left in them, only exhaustion. "It was not destroyed." Every face turned toward him again. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket with deliberate movements. Several security guards instinctively stepped forward, but Ethan lifted one hand, stopping them. Richard removed an old leather card holder, faded from years of use. Inside rested a second brass key. Its surface reflected the pale library lights with the same worn shine as Naomi's. A collective breath swept across the room. Richard stared at the key for several long seconds before extending it toward Ethan. "I kept it because I believed I was protecting your family." Ethan did not take it. "Or yourself?" Richard lowered his head. He had no answer. Naomi watched the exchange in complete silence. Then something else caught her attention. Resting inside the card holder, partially hidden beneath the second key, was a tiny photograph no larger than a postage stamp. She recognized the woman immediately. Margaret Harrington. But she was not alone. Standing beside her was a little boy no older than 6. Ethan leaned closer, confusion filling his face. "That is not me." The words barely escaped his lips. Naomi looked from the photograph to the letter, then to the ledger lying open across the desk. Every date. Every signature. Every missing record suddenly aligned in her mind with terrifying clarity. Her pulse slowed instead of racing. "We have been asking the wrong question," she said almost in a whisper. The room felt perfectly still. Ethan searched her face. "Then what is the right one?" Naomi looked toward the dark archive hallway where a single elevator indicator silently changed from basement level 3 to basement level 2. "If that is not you in the photograph," she said, "then who reached box 17 before we did?" The elevator indicator blinked once, then stopped at basement level 2. No one breathed. The library had fallen into a silence so complete that the faint vibration of fluorescent lights overhead seemed impossibly loud. Ethan's eyes never left Naomi. For the first time since they had met, he waited for her to speak instead of interrupting. Naomi looked at the tiny photograph again. The little boy beside Margaret Harrington wore a wool coat with one button missing. Her gaze shifted to the old ledger still lying open across the desk. She turned 3 fragile pages with slow, careful fingers. Dust drifted through the pale light. Then she stopped. "There," she whispered. The archivist leaned closer. So did Ethan. A handwritten notation had been squeezed into the page margin, almost hidden beneath a later correction. "Temporary identity assigned." Beneath it was a number instead of a name. Ethan frowned. "That makes no sense." Naomi shook her head gently. "It does if someone wanted a child to disappear without anyone asking questions." The words settled over the room like cold air. Richard closed his eyes. His shoulders sank lower. One of the investors slowly lowered his phone. Another removed his glasses altogether. Nobody was watching Naomi as the quiet librarian anymore. They were watching the only person who seemed capable of assembling fragments everyone else had overlooked. Ethan looked at her carefully. "You saw this before any of us," Naomi answered without pride. "Librarians do not search for what is obvious. We search for what does not belong." Richard let out a long breath that sounded almost painful. "She is right." Every face turned toward him again. "For 30 years," he said quietly, "I convinced myself that protecting one secret would save an entire family." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Did it?" Richard stared at the marble floor. "No." His voice barely carried across the room. "It destroyed every one of us." The confession landed harder than any accusation could have. The reporters stopped whispering. Even the security guards remained perfectly still. Naomi stepped toward the archive corridor, her footsteps soft against the polished stone. "Someone is still down there," she said. "And whoever reached box 17 already knows we are close." Ethan followed her without hesitation. The movement shocked everyone. Only an hour earlier he had dismissed her in front of the entire room. Now he was following her lead without a single question. Behind them, the elderly archivist suddenly looked toward a row of framed historical photographs mounted along the wall. His expression changed instantly. "Wait!" His trembling voice echoed through the library. Naomi stopped. The archivist pointed toward a photograph taken during the library's grand reopening decades earlier. Hundreds of smiling faces filled the image. Naomi walked closer. Ethan stood beside her. Richard remained several steps behind, his breathing slow and heavy. Naomi narrowed her eyes. "Enlarge this," she said to one of the reporters holding a tablet. Within seconds, the image expanded across the bright screen. Gasps spread through the crowd. Standing in the background, nearly hidden behind a stone column, was the same unidentified little boy from the tiny photograph. But beside him stood another figure everyone recognized instantly. Richard. Much younger. Looking directly into the camera. His hand rested protectively on the child's shoulder. Ethan's voice broke. "If that child was not me, then who have we been searching for all these years?" Before anyone could answer, a soft vibration echoed from inside Richard's coat pocket. His forgotten phone lit up one final time. The message contained only a single sentence. "He knows you found the photograph." Richard stared at the screen in horror. Then he slowly whispered, "He is coming here himself." Richard's phone slipped from his hand and landed softly on the marble floor. Nobody reached for it. The faint vibration echoed through the library before fading into silence. Every face remained fixed on Naomi. The cold overhead lights reflected in dozens of stunned eyes that had only an hour earlier dismissed her as an interruption. Now the room seemed to breathe with her. Ethan slowly turned toward Naomi, the confidence that had once defined every movement replaced by quiet uncertainty. His voice was barely audible. "I should have listened to you the first time." Naomi met his eyes without triumph. "You did listen," she answered gently. "It just took the truth a little longer to reach you." The words settled over the room with unexpected warmth. Several reporters lowered their cameras, forgetting for a moment that they were supposed to document history instead of feeling it. Richard remained motionless, staring at the photographs still displayed on the tablet screen. The years seemed to collapse across his face all at once. "I thought silence would protect him," he whispered. "Instead, it became another prison." No one challenged him. No one defended him. The investors who had questioned Naomi only minutes before now stood in complete silence, avoiding her gaze. One board member quietly stepped forward. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice carrying unmistakable regret, "we judged you before we understood what you were trying to protect." Naomi offered only a small nod. "The records mattered more than being right." Ethan looked around the library as though seeing it for the first time. Shelves stretched into the distance beneath warm reading lamps, each filled with stories waiting for someone patient enough to uncover them. His eyes returned to Naomi. You preserve something every lawyer, every advisor, and even I failed to see. Naomi glanced toward the archive hallway where the elevator remained still behind closed steel doors. History rarely disappears, she said quietly. It waits until someone is willing to face it. The elderly archivist smiled through tired eyes. That is exactly why libraries exist. A soft murmur spread through the crowd. It was no longer curiosity. It was respect. Several guests instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path through the center of the room without anyone asking them to move. Naomi had not demanded space. She had earned it. Ethan slowly approached her. The polished marble reflected both of them standing side by side, no longer separated by status or misunderstanding. He extended the faded envelope back into her hands. Without you, he said, this would have remained forgotten forever. Naomi accepted it carefully, almost reverently. It was never mine to keep. Ethan lowered his head for a brief moment, overcome by the weight of everything he had misunderstood. Around them, the library had become almost perfectly still. Even the ventilation system seemed quieter now. The only sound came from the distant ticking of an old wall clock that had measured every passing year while the truth remained hidden. Then the elevator chimed. Every head turned toward the archive corridor. The steel doors slid open with slow mechanical precision. Warm air drifted upward from the underground vaults, carrying the scent of old cedar boxes and yellowed paper. A single figure stepped into the light, holding a weathered archive case against his chest. He looked directly at Ethan before his eyes shifted to Naomi. His expression was not fearful. It was relieved. Then he spoke the words no one in the room had expected to hear. I have been waiting 30 years for someone like you to find me. The man set the weathered archive case gently on the oak reading table as though it carried something far heavier than paper. Nobody reached for it. Nobody even spoke. The library, so loud with doubt only an hour before, had become almost sacred in its silence. The last few phones were lowered. Camera lights faded one after another until only the warm glow of the reading lamps reflected across the brass corners of the old case. Ethan stood motionless, his breathing slow, his eyes fixed on the stranger. The man carefully opened the lid. Inside lay neatly tied bundles of letters, school drawings, birthday cards, and photographs that had never reached their destination. On top rested a simple note in Margaret Harrington's familiar handwriting. Ethan unfolded it with trembling fingers. If you are reading this, someone finally chose truth over fear. His vision blurred. The room disappeared around him. Every birthday she had missed. Every Christmas he believed she had forgotten. Every year he had carried resentment like a stone inside his chest. None of it had been abandonment. It had been silence, carefully built by people who believed they were protecting him. Richard removed his glasses. Tears filled eyes that had spent decades hiding behind contracts and legal language. I cannot return what I took from you, he said quietly. I can only admit that I was wrong. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. The anger he expected never arrived. Only exhaustion. The truth would have hurt, Ethan answered softly. But the lie lasted 30 years. Richard lowered his head. No defense remained. Across the room, every investor, every donor, every guest stood without speaking. Their attention slowly shifted toward Naomi. She had not argued the loudest. She had not demanded recognition. She had simply refused to let one forgotten story disappear. The elderly archivist smiled faintly before placing an old brass nameplate on the reading table. It had been wrapped inside the archive case all along. The engraved words caught the afternoon light. Margaret Harrington Memorial Collection. Preserved by Naomi Brooks. Ethan looked at the plate, then at Naomi. He stepped forward and gently offered her the library card that had been tucked inside the first forgotten book. I believe this belongs with you, he said. Naomi accepted it with both hands. No, she replied with a quiet smile. It belongs here, where someone else might need it someday. Ethan nodded. For the first time, he understood. Some people build fortunes. Others protect memories. Only one of those can rescue a life decades later. The stranger quietly closed the archived case. Richard stepped aside without being asked. The path through the library opened naturally, not because anyone held power, but because everyone had finally recognized integrity. Outside, the rain had stopped. Golden evening light spilled through the tall windows, washing across shelves that held thousands of forgotten stories still waiting to be found. Naomi returned the first letter to its protective sleeve, straightened the corner with gentle fingers, and placed it on the display table beneath the warm lamp. She turned toward the next cart of returned books as though it were another ordinary day at work. Behind her, Ethan remained standing in respectful silence. He no longer saw a librarian. He saw the woman who had given him back his mother without ever trying to keep the credit. As Naomi disappeared between the quiet shelves, the soft rustle of turning pages became the only sound left in the building, and somehow it felt exactly like justice.